The colony ship burned as it fell through the atmosphere of Thessera Prime, like a dying star across the emerald sky. And inside the vessel alarms screamed, while colonists grabbed whatever they could carry, before the final impact shook the entire forest moon and sent ancient trees toppling in every direction. Captain Maya Torres pulled herself from the wreckage with blood running down her face, and all around her, people were crying out for help or calling names of loved ones who might not have survived, and the air smelled of smoke and burning metal mixed with the sweet scent of alien flowers crushed beneath the shattered hull. She counted heads quickly and found that 243 souls had made it out alive from the 500 who started this journey, and her heart ached for every loss. But there was no time to grieve because the Krath were coming, and she could already hear their chittering war cries echoing through the forest. The insectoid hunters moved through the trees like nightmares, given form with their black carapaces gleaming and mandibles clicking in anticipation of fresh prey. And Maya raised her rifle alongside the other survivors who could still fight, but they all knew the truth without speaking it aloud, that they were exhausted and outgunned, and this would likely be their final stand. Then the sky above them erupted in crimson flame. Maya looked up to see a creature that belonged in ancient human mythology soaring between the massive trees, and it was a dragon with scales the color of molten rubies and wings that seemed to drink the sunlight, and on its back rode a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. The rider was female with silver, hair that flowed like liquid moonlight, and skin that seemed to shimmer with a faint ethereal glow, and she wore armor that looked grown rather than forged with patterns like leaves and vines worked into its surface, and in her hands she held a spear that crackled with energy that seemed alive. The dragon opened its jaws and fire poured forth. Not the random blast of a mindless beast, but precise, controlled streams that found every Krath position with devastating accuracy, and the insects shrieked as they burned while their formation collapsed into chaos. Maya watched in stunned amazement as the silver-haired warrior guided her mount through a series of aerial maneuvers that should have been impossible, and the dragon responded to the slightest shift of her weight or touch of her hand against its neck, and together they moved like water flowing around stone, finding every gap in the enemy defenses. Within minutes, the Krath assault force lay scattered and broken across the forest floor. The dragon landed with surprising grace despite its massive size, and the warrior slid from its back with movements that seemed to flow like music, and she approached the colonists with cautious steps, while her violet eyes studied them with an intensity that made Maya feel like a specimen. Under examination, Dr. Claire Bennett stepped forward with her hands raised in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace, and she activated her translator device while trying to find words that might bridge the gap between their species. The warrior woman tilted her head in a gesture that reminded Maya of a curious bird, and when she spoke, her voice was melodic and strange with tones that the human ear struggled to process, and the translator worked frantically to make sense of the alien language. "Your kind fights poorly but with determination," and the warrior said, through the crackling translation, "and you protect your weak ones even when it costs you tactical advantage. And this is unusual." Claire managed a weak smile despite her exhaustion, and said, "We protect each other because that is what makes us human, and we are grateful for your help, even though we do not understand why you gave it." The warrior studied Claire for a long moment, and her dragon moved closer to sniff at the gathered humans with nostrils that glowed faintly from within. And Maya noticed that the warrior kept one hand constantly touching the dragon's neck as if maintaining some vital connection between them. "I am called Silvara of the Verdant Reaches," and the warrior said, "and this is Ember, who has chosen to bond with me, and we have watched your species spread across this sector with interest because you do things that make no sense to us." "Like what?" and Claire asked. While trying to keep her voice steady under that intense violet gaze, Silvara gestured toward a group of colonists nearby where a woman was holding a crying child close to her chest while rocking back and forth, and you touch each other constantly even when not mating or fighting, and you press your bodies together when distressed, and this seems to calm you somehow. And among my people such contact would be seen as weakness or threat. Maya found herself stepping closer, despite the strangeness of this conversation, and she said, "We touch, because it reminds us we are not alone, and in darkness, we reach for each other, because connection gives us strength." The concept seemed to genuinely puzzle Silvara, and she looked at Ember as if seeking confirmation of what she was hearing. And the dragon rumbled deep in its chest while keeping its glowing eyes fixed on the humans. Maya made a decision and stepped forward with her hand extended in the traditional human greeting, and she said, "Thank you for saving our lives. And I am Captain Maya Torres, and I would be honored to shake your hand as a gesture of gratitude and friendship." Silvara stared at the offered hand as if Maya had just presented her with a live grenade, and she actually took a step backward while her other hand tightened on her spear. "And you wish to touch me?" And she asked with something that might have been alarm in her voice, and to create what you call a trust bond through physical contact. Maya kept her hand steady and nodded while saying it. "Is just a handshake, and it is how humans greet friends and allies, and it means we see you as someone worthy of respect." For a long moment, Silvara simply stared, and Ember leaned down to examine Maya's extended hand with obvious curiosity, and the dragon made a sound that might have been questioning, and Silvara responded in her own language with tones too quick for the translator to catch. Finally, Silvara reached out slowly as if approaching something dangerous, and her fingers were longer than human ones with an extra joint. And when their hands met, Maya felt a shock of something that was not quite electricity, but similar. Silvara gasped and pulled back immediately, and her eyes were wide with an emotion Maya could not name, and she looked at her own hand as if it had betrayed her and whispered something in her language that the translator rendered as impossible. Before Maya could ask what was wrong, the ground beneath them shook, and everyone looked up to see the clouds above them beginning to glow with the telltale signs of orbital bombardment preparation. Silvara followed their gaze, and her expression hardened into something cold and ancient, and she said, "The Krath swarm ships have found you, and they will burn this entire region to ash to ensure no survivors." Claire stepped forward with desperation clear in her voice and asked, "Is there anywhere we can go and anywhere we might survive?" Silvara was quiet for several heartbeats, while she seemed to wage some internal war, and her hand kept flexing as if she could still feel the phantom touch of Maya's handshake, and finally she said, "There is an ancient place deep in the planetary core, and an outpost of my people abandoned long ago. And if we move quickly, I can guide you there before the bombardment begins." Maya did not hesitate, and she turned to her people and began shouting orders for everyone to gather supplies and prepare to move. And beside her, Silvara watched with those intense violet eyes, and her hand remained pressed against Ember's scales, as if drawing strength from the contact. Claire approached Silvara, while the others prepared and asked, "Why are you helping us when you said your people do not interfere?" Silvara looked at her hand again, and then at the humans scrambling to save each other, while the stronger ones carried the injured, and parents held their children close, and she said, "I do not know, and your strange touching customs have disturbed something in me, and I must understand what power lies in such simple contact that it makes your species fight so fiercely to protect these bonds." Ember rumbled and pressed his massive head against Silvara's shoulder in what looked distinctly like comfort, and she touched him back automatically, and for just a moment her expression softened into something that might have been loneliness. The sky above them began to glow brighter as the Krath ships charged their weapons, and Maya called out that they needed to move now, and Silvara nodded before mounting Ember in one fluid motion. She looked down at the gathered humans, and said, "Stay close to Ember and follow where his shadow falls, and do not stop moving no matter what you hear behind you." Then she urged her dragon into the air and began leading them deeper into the alien forest, while above them the sky prepared to rain fire, and Maya ran alongside her people while wondering what mystery lay in a simple handshake that could make an immortal warrior risk everything to understand it. The journey through the forest felt endless as the colonists followed Ember's shadow through terrain that seemed designed to break human spirits, and behind them, the sky lit up with explosions that turned night into day, and the sound of destruction followed like thunder that never stopped. Silvara flew ahead on scouting runs, and each time she returned, she studied the humans with that same intense curiosity, and Maya noticed how the warrior watched whenever someone helped another over difficult terrain, or when parents carried exhausted children on their shoulders. On the third day of travel, they stopped to rest in a canyon carved by some ancient river, and Claire approached Silvara, who was maintaining her weapons, while Ember dozed nearby, and the doctor carried 2 ration packs in her hands. Claire offered one to Silvara and said, "You should eat something, and we have enough to share." Silvara looked at the offered food with suspicion and asked, "Why do you give me this when your own supplies are limited, and I could simply take what I need if I desired it? Because sharing food is how humans show care for others." "And," Claire replied while sitting down beside the warrior, "and it is another way we bond and another form of touching, without actually touching." This clearly fascinated Silvara, and she accepted the ration pack while asking, "Does all human interaction involve this constant exchange of care and contact? And how do you maintain any sense of individual strength when you are always leaning on others?" Claire smiled tiredly and said, "We are stronger together than apart, and one person alone might survive. But our group that supports each other will thrive, and our weakness is that we need connection, but our strength is that we choose to give it freely." Silvara ate in silence while processing this, and then she said, "My people bond only through combat trials and blood oaths, and we prove our worth by standing alone against impossible odds, and physical affection is seen as dependency, which leads to weakness when that person is lost." "That sounds incredibly lonely," and Claire said softly. For the first time, Silvara's mask cracked, and she looked away while saying, "We are a dying people, and we have isolated ourselves for so long that we have forgotten how to be anything else. And I watch your kind comfort each other after losses, and I wonder if perhaps we chose the wrong path." Before Claire could respond, a scream echoed through the canyon. Maya was already moving with her rifle raised, and she found Lieutenant Kate Morrison crouched beside a colonist who had fallen and twisted her ankle badly, and the woman was crying from pain and fear, and Kate had her arm around the injured colonist's shoulders while speaking quietly to calm her. Silvara appeared beside Maya and watched as Kate gently examined the injury while maintaining constant physical contact with the frightened woman, and the warrior tilted her head with that bird-like curiosity again. She touches her, even though it serves no medical purpose, and Silvara observed, "It serves an emotional purpose," and Maya explained. "And fear and pain are easier to bear when someone is there with you, and when you know you are not alone." Silvara reached out as if to touch Maya's shoulder and then stopped herself with her hand hovering in the air, and she pulled back quickly while something that looked like frustration crossed her face, and Ember, who had been watching, rumbled in a tone that sounded almost encouraging. The injured colonist was helped to her feet with Kate supporting most of her weight, and Silvara said, "Your lieutenant will be slowed by carrying this burden, and it would be more efficient to leave the injured behind." Maya turned to face the warrior with steel in her voice and said, "We do not leave anyone behind, and that is not negotiable. And if you do not understand that, then you do not understand humans at all." They stared at each other for a long moment, and then Silvara did something unexpected, and she walked over to the injured woman and knelt down and said, "I will carry you, and Ember is strong enough to bear additional weight." The colonist looked terrified, but Kate encouraged her, with gentle touches and reassuring words, and eventually she agreed to ride on the dragon's back, and Silvara helped her up with surprising gentleness, and her hands lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary. As they continued traveling, Silvara began asking Claire questions constantly about human bonding customs, and she wanted to know about handshakes and hugs and why humans held hands, and what purpose was served by putting an arm around someone's shoulders. Claire answered each question patiently, and sometimes demonstrated with other colonists who were initially nervous about the strange warrior, but gradually warmed to her curiosity, and Maya watched this exchange with growing understanding. Silvara was not just curious, and she was hungry for connection in a way that spoke of centuries of loneliness. On the 7th day, they were ambushed by a Krath ground force in a narrow pass. The battle was brutal and fast, and Maya found herself fighting back-to-back with Silvara, and the warrior's movements were like deadly poetry, while every strike of her spear found its mark with precision that seemed almost precognitive. A Krath warrior broke through their line and lunged at Maya from her blind side, and she would have died. But Silvara moved faster than thought and threw herself between Maya and the attack, and the Krath's blade scored across Silvara's armor, leaving a burning line across her ribs. The warrior killed the insect with a single thrust, but she staggered, and Maya caught her before she fell. They won the battle, but at a cost, and 3 colonists were dead and a dozen more injured, including Maya, who had taken a plasma burn across her left arm while protecting Silvara. From a second attack, Claire worked on Maya's wound with practiced efficiency, while the captain sat on a rock and tried not to show how much it hurt, and Silvara stood nearby watching as the doctor cleaned and bandaged the injury with gentle hands, while speaking quietly to distract Maya from the pain. When Claire finished, she patted Maya's shoulder and said, "There you go, and all patched up, and you will be fine." Silvara stepped forward hesitantly, and her eyes were fixed on where Claire's hand rested on Maya's shoulder, and she asked, "Does the touching actually reduce the physical pain, or is it only emotional comfort?" Both, and Claire said, and human brains process physical comfort as a mild pain reliever, and touch releases chemicals that help us heal faster and make us feel safer and less afraid. Silvara was quiet for a moment, and then she reached out slowly and placed her hand on Maya's other shoulder in a mirror of what Claire had done, and her touch was feather-light, as if she feared breaking something fragile. Maya looked up at the warrior and smiled, despite her pain, and said, "Thank you for saving my life." The contact lasted perhaps 5 seconds before Silvara pulled away, but Maya saw the warrior's hand tremble, and her eyes were wide with something that looked like wonder mixed with fear. Ember moved closer and pressed his head against Silvara's side, and she wrapped her arms around the dragon's neck in an embrace that spoke of desperate need for grounding. And through their bond, she seemed to be sharing what she felt. That night, while others slept, Claire found Silvara sitting alone and staring at her hands, and the doctor sat beside her and asked, "Are you all right? I do not know," and Silvara whispered, "And when I touched your captain, I felt something I have never experienced, and it was like warmth spreading from the point of contact, and for just a moment, I was not alone in a way that even my bond with Ember cannot provide, and I do not understand how such a simple gesture can carry so much power." Claire considered this, and then asked, "Would you like to try another human comfort ritual?" Silvara looked at her with both hope and terror, and what ritual? A hug, and Claire said, "And it is when 2 people embrace to show care and support, and it is one of the most powerful bonding gestures we have." Silvara stood up as if preparing for battle and said, "Show me." Claire stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the warrior and pulled her into a gentle embrace, and for a moment Silvara stood rigid with her arms at her sides. And then, slowly, hesitantly, she brought her arms up and returned the hug. The sound Silvara made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. She held on to Claire as if the doctor was the only thing keeping her from drowning, and her whole body shook, and centuries of isolation seemed to crack open all at once, and Ember lifted his head and roared softly, feeling everything his rider felt through their bond. When they finally separated, Silvara had tears running down her face, and she said, "How do you bear it? And how do you give pieces of yourself away like this, and not fear the loss when they are gone?" "We do fear it," and Claire said gently, but we choose connection anyway, because a life without these bonds is not worth living, and you can survive alone, but you cannot truly thrive." Silvara wiped her eyes and looked toward where the colonists slept in groups, huddled close together even in rest, and she said, "I must contact my people, and we are close enough to the outpost now, but if I reveal our presence here, the Krath will know the Silvani still exist, and it will break our isolation forever." "Then why do it?" and Claire asked. "Because," and Silvara said, while looking at her hands again, "and because I have felt what you call connection, and I cannot let you die when I have the power to save you," and Ember agrees, even though it goes against everything we were taught. Before Claire could respond, alarms began sounding from their perimeter. Krath forces had found them again, and worse. Their scanning equipment showed a massive Krath dreadnought in orbit, preparing to obliterate the entire region. Silvara looked at Ember and then at the humans who were scrambling to defensive positions, and she made her choice. She raised her communicator and spoke in her own language with words that rang with finality, and above them, the sky began to shimmer as ships emerged from dark space. The Silvani fleet had arrived, but so had the Krath dreadnought, and both forces moved into attack positions, while the small group on the ground stood between two colliding civilizations. Maya appeared beside Silvara, with her weapon ready, and asked, "What happens now?" "Now," and Silvara said while touching Maya's arm, in what was becoming a familiar gesture of connection, "and now we see if your human bonds are strong enough to teach my people what we have forgotten, or if we all die together trying." The Silvani fleet hung in the sky like silver daggers catching starlight, and their ships were beautiful and deadly in equal measure, with designs that seemed to grow organically rather than being built, and Maya watched them with a mixture of awe and apprehension. A communication channel opened, and a voice spoke in the same melodic tones as Silvara, but colder and harder, without any warmth, and the translator rendered the words as clear accusation. "You have broken the pact of silence," and the voice said, "and you have exposed our people to the enemy, and called us to defend lesser beings, and explain yourself, Silvara, of the verdant reaches, or be cast out from our number forever." Silvara stood straighter, and her hand found Ember's neck, as she always did when seeking strength, and she replied, "These humans possess knowledge we have lost, and they bond through touch and create strength from connection, and I have experienced it myself, and it is not weakness as we believed." Laughter came through the channel, but it was bitter and mocking. "And you risk our entire civilization for curiosity about alien mating rituals," and the fleet commander said, "and you shame your lineage and your bond with Ember." Ember roared in response, and the sound shook the ground, and Silvara said, "They do not touch only for mating, and they touch to heal, and to comfort, and to build trust that transcends individual survival, and I have felt it, Commander, and it is power we cannot comprehend, because we have denied ourselves this knowledge for too long." Before the commander could respond, the Krath dreadnought fired, and the Silvani fleet scattered like leaves in a storm, while return fire lit the sky with colors that had no names, and the battle had begun. Maya gathered her people and began organizing defenses, but the mood among the colonists had changed, and there was fear now mixed with suspicion, and she saw people clustering in small groups while casting dark glances at others. Claire approached and said, "We have a problem and people are scared. And when humans get scared, they start looking for someone to blame." Kate appeared from the perimeter with a grim expression and said, "It's worse than that. and we caught someone trying to send a signal to the Krath, and we have a traitor." The revelation hit like a physical blow, and Maya felt her stomach drop, and she asked who a colonist named Paul Grant, and Kate said, and he claims he was trying to negotiate safe passage for his family, and he says the Krath promised to spare anyone who helped them locate human settlements. The group gathered in the center of their camp, while Paul stood in the middle with his hands bound and his wife and 2 children huddled nearby crying, and the man looked terrified but also defiant. "I did what I had to do, and Paul shouted, and you would all do the same to protect your families, and the Krath guaranteed safe passage, and all I had to do was give them coordinates." Someone lunged at him, but Maya stepped between them, and she said, "We do not solve this with violence, and we are better than that." "Are we?" and another colonist yelled, "and my sister died in the crash because of his information, and he sold us out, and he deserves to die for it." The camp erupted into argument, with some calling for execution and others begging for mercy, and families turned against each other, and Maya saw everything they had built together starting to fracture. Silvara watched from the edge of the gathering, and her expression was unreadable, but Maya noticed how the warrior kept looking at her own hands, and then at the angry humans, and back again, as if trying to understand something. Claire tried to calm people down, but emotions were running too high, and someone threw a rock that hit Paul in the head, and his wife screamed and rushed to him while the children wailed in terror. Maya fired her weapon into the air, and the sharp crack of the shot brought silence. "We are human," and she said with steel in her voice, "and we protect each other. And yes, Paul betrayed us, and yes, people died because of his choices, but we do not become monsters in response, and we do not murder families, and we find another way." "What other way?" and someone demanded. "And among my people he would be executed without question for such betrayal." Silvara stepped forward, and her voice cut through the tension. "And among my people." "Yes, but I have been learning from you humans that there might be better ways." Everyone turned to look at the warrior, and she seemed uncomfortable with the attention, but continued speaking. "And you told me that touch heals, and that connection creates strength from weakness, and perhaps instead of casting out the broken parts, you should try to repair them." "That is naive alien thinking," and Kate said harshly, "and he killed our people. He was desperate and afraid." And Silvara replied, "And among humans, do you not teach that fear makes poor decisions, and that support and community help people become better? And I have watched you comfort each other through grief, and I have felt your touch heal emotional wounds, and perhaps this should be tested here." Paul looked at Silvara with surprise, and Maya felt something shift in her chest, and she asked, "What are you suggesting? Among my people, betrayal means death or exile, and—" Silvara said, But you humans seem to believe people can change when given support, and let this be the test, and let him remain. But let him earn back trust through service, and let your community bond help him become better than his fear made him." The suggestion was met with mixed reactions, but Maya seized on it, and she said, "Silvara is right, and we can choose to be better than our anger. And Paul will work to help rebuild what he damaged, and his family stays with us, and we watch him, and if he proves himself, then perhaps he can be trusted again, and if not, then we exile him when we are safe." It was not a perfect solution, and Maya could see that many were still angry, but the moment of violence had passed, and people began to disperse while muttering among themselves. Claire found Maya afterward and said, "That was risky, I know," and Maya replied, But did you see Silvera's face? And she is trying to understand how we heal our communities and how we use connection to fix what is broken. And if we had executed Paul, we would have proven that our way is no different than the Silvani isolation." That night, the camp was quieter than usual, and people stayed in tight family groups, and the easy camaraderie from before the betrayal was gone, and Silvara walked among them, observing how they coped differently. She found one woman sitting alone and crying, and after a moment of hesitation, Silvara sat beside her, and the woman looked up in surprise. "You weep alone," and Silvara said, "And why do the others not comfort you?" "They have their own grief," and the woman said, "and I do not wish to burden them." Silvara frowned and said, "That is not what I observed before, and you all shared burdens freely, and what has changed?" "Trust," and the woman said simply, "and when you learn someone can betray you, it makes you wonder who else might do the same, and so you pull back and you protect yourself." This seemed to genuinely distress Silvara, and she said, "But then you lose the very bonds that gave you strength, and you become isolated like my people, and is that not letting the betrayal win?" The woman had no answer, and Silvara hesitantly reached out and put her hand on the woman's shoulder in the way she had seen humans do, and the gesture was awkward but sincere. "I do not fully understand your ways yet," and Silvara said, but I know that when Claire held me, I felt less alone than I have in centuries, and perhaps you should not let fear steal that from you." The woman started crying harder, but she leaned into the touch, and Silvara awkwardly put her arm around the crying human while looking around as if for guidance, and Ember came over and laid his head across both their laps, and the dragon's warmth seemed to help Claire found them like that, and she sat down on Silvara's other side and wrapped her arm around the warrior's shoulders, and for a moment they sat in silence, sharing grief and comfort and connection. "This is what we do," and Claire said softly, "and we touch and we hold and we remind each other that we are not alone." Silvara closed her eyes, and Maya, who had been watching from a distance, saw a single tear roll down the warrior's cheek. The next morning brought new crisis as the orbital battle intensified and a Sylvani ship took critical damage and began falling toward the surface, and the Krath dreadnought charged weapons that would crack the planet itself. The Sylvani commander contacted Silvara again and said, "We cannot hold them, and the dreadnought will fire within hours, and all life on this world will end, and your experiment with human bonding has failed." "No." And Silvara said, "And I have one more thing to try, and something my people abandoned long ago." "What?" and the commander demanded. "Unity," and Silvara replied, "and true unity through connection, and not through blood oaths, and through willing touch, and through choosing to stand together, not because we must, but because we wish to." "You speak madness," and the commander said, "Then let me show you." And Silvara answered, "And send down your skeptics, and send those who doubt, and let them see what human bonds can accomplish." Maya stepped beside Silvara and asked, "What are you planning?" "Something that will either save us all or destroy what remains of my people's pride." And Silvara said, But I have held Claire, and I have touched you, and I have felt Ember's bond expand to include echoes of human warmth. And if we can combine Sylvani psychic unity with human physical connection, we might create something powerful enough to stop that dreadnought." "That sounds impossible." And Kate said, "So did your handshake," and Silvara replied while looking at Maya, "And yet it changed everything." The Sylvani ships descended through the burning sky and landed in a clearing near the human camp, and Maya watched as warriors emerged who looked similar to Silvara with their silver hair and violet eyes, but their expressions held nothing but cold disdain. The lead warrior approached, and her armor was more ornate than Silvera's, and she radiated authority, like winter radiates cold, and she spoke without bothering to look at the humans. "I am Commander Varys," and she said, "And I have come as you requested, Silvara, and show me this miracle of touching that you claim will save us from the Krath." Silvara stood her ground and said, "It requires you to be willing, and it requires you to trust in lesser beings," and Varys scoffed, "And you ask too much. Then we all die," and Silvara replied, "And the dreadnought charges its planet cracker, and our fleet cannot stop it, and our only chance is to activate the ancient shield network that lies beneath this outpost, but it requires a bonded collective, and something our people have not achieved in 1,000 years. Because it is weakness," and another Sylvani warrior said, "And individual strength is all that matters." Maya stepped forward and said, Individual strength kept you alive, but it also kept you isolated and alone and dying out as a species. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is reach for help. The Sylvani warriors looked at her as if she were an insect presuming to lecture scholars. Claire moved to Maya's side and said, "Just try it, and what do you have to lose when the alternative is death?" Varys was silent for a long moment, and then she said, "Very well, and show us this human bonding, and if it fails, then at least we die, knowing we tried everything." The clearing became a strange gathering as humans and Sylvani mingled awkwardly, and the warriors looked uncomfortable and the humans looked nervous, and Ember moved among them all while rumbling encouragement. Silvara stood in the center and said, "The shield network requires psychic unity, and each tower must be linked to the next, and among my people, this was done through blood bonds and through pain shared in combat, but we lost the knowledge of how to link more than 2 or 3 individuals. And you think human touching will somehow replace centuries of training?" And Varys asked. "Yes," and Silvara said, "and because I have felt it, and when Claire embraced me, I felt connected in ways my bond with Ember cannot provide, and it is different, but equally powerful. And if we combine both methods, we might achieve what neither can do alone." She looked at Maya and held out her hand in the same gesture Maya had offered during their first meeting. And this time there was no hesitation, and Maya took Silvara's hand and held it firmly. Silvara gasped as she did before, but this time she did not pull away, and she reached her other hand to Varys and said, "Take my hand, Commander, and feel what I feel." Varys looked disgusted, but she was not a coward, and she gripped Silvara's other hand, and her eyes widened immediately. "What is this?" And she whispered, "And I feel warmth where there should be nothing, and I sense the human through you, and it is strange and foreign and unexpectedly comforting." Claire began organizing people into a circle, and humans and Sylvani alternating, and she taught them to hold hands and to breathe together, and the Sylvani warriors trembled at the contact, but slowly they adjusted. Ember moved to the center and lowered his massive head, and Silvara placed her free hand on his scales and said, "Now we connect through our bond, and all Sylvani reach for your dragon sense, and all humans reach for the warmth you feel in each other." The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Maya felt something flow through her like electricity, but warmer and more alive, and she could sense not just Silvara beside her, but Claire on her other side, and Kate beyond that, and the Sylvani warriors, and even Ember, who was at the center of it all, like the sun at the heart of a solar system. The ancient towers buried beneath the forest began to pulse with light. Energy flowed from the circle outward in waves that spread across the entire moon, and one by one the forgotten towers activated and rose from the ground where they had slept for millennia, and they connected to each other through streams of pure power. In orbit, the Krath dreadnought fired its planet cracker. The shield rose to meet it, and the collision was cataclysmic, and the sky turned white, and the ground shook hard enough to knock people down, but they held on to each other, and they maintained the circle, and they poured everything they had into the shield. Silvara stood at the center with Ember, and she was the conduit, through which all the energy flowed, and her body glowed with power that should have burned her to ash. But the human hands holding hers, and the Sylvani warriors channeling through her, and the dragon anchoring her, all created a balance that kept her stable. The shield held. The Krath weapon spent itself against the barrier and dissipated into nothing. And in that moment of shock, the combined human and Sylvani fleet struck back. Kate, who had released the circle, ran to coordinate with Sylvani pilots, and she showed them human tactics about flying in formation and covering each other's blind spots, and the Sylvani showed her how to read the flow of battle through psychic awareness. Dragons carried human bombers who used precision targeting, while Sylvani shields protected human ships, and the combination was devastating because the Krath had prepared to fight isolated enemies and not unified forces. Maya coordinated ground forces and found herself working alongside Varys, who had left the circle to command her warriors, and the two of them created strategies that blended human adaptability with Sylvani precision. The dreadnought tried to retreat, but it was too slow and too damaged, and the combined fleet tore it apart section by section until finally its core breached, and it died in a bloom of fire that lit up the system. Victory came with a price. 17 humans were dead, and 9 Sylvani warriors and Ember had taken damage protecting the circle, and Silvera collapsed as soon as the shield deactivated, and she fell into Maya's arms. Claire rushed over to check her vitals and said she is alive but exhausted, and she channeled more power than any individual should be able to handle. Silvara opened her eyes slowly and looked up at Maya and whispered, "Did it work, and did the bond hold?" It held. And Maya said with tears running down her face, "And you magnificent idiot, and it held, and we won." Silvara smiled weakly and said, "I felt everyone and every human and every Sylvani and every echo of emotion and fear and hope and determination, and it was beautiful and terrifying, and I understand now." "Understand what?" And Claire asked, "Why you do this?" And Silvara said, "And why you touch and why you bond, and because isolation is death and connection is life, and my people have been dying for centuries because we forgot this simple truth." Varys approached and knelt beside Silvara, and the commander had tears on her face, which seemed to shock her as much as it shocked everyone else. "I felt it too," and Varys said, "And I felt what it means to not be alone, and I have commanded fleets for 300 years, and I thought I understood strength, and I was wrong." She reached out hesitantly and touched Silvara's shoulder, and the gesture was awkward but genuine, and Silvara covered Varys' hand with her own. Ember lifted his head and rumbled, and suddenly every dragon in the Sylvani fleet responded with their own calls, and the sound was like music that had not been heard in ages. A young Sylvani warrior approached the humans with wonder in her eyes, and she asked, "Can you teach us more, and can you show us all the ways you bond?" Claire laughed and said, "We can try, and we have hugs and handshakes and high fives and shoulder pats and sitting close and sharing meals and 1,000 other small touches that build connection." The warrior looked overwhelmed and said, "How do you remember them?" "All. You do not remember." And Kate said, "And you just feel when someone needs connection, and you reach out, and sometimes they reach back, and sometimes they do not, but you keep trying." Over the next hours, as people tended wounds and mourned losses and celebrated survival, the barriers between humans and Sylvani began to dissolve. Maya found Silvara sitting with Ember and watching the two species mingle. "It is strange." And Silvara said as Maya sat beside her, "And a week ago I would have killed to protect our isolation, and now I cannot imagine going back to that loneliness. You do not have to." And Maya said, "And we are in this together now." Silvara leaned against Maya's shoulder, and the gesture was becoming natural now, and she said, "I was wrong before when I said touch creates weakness, and it creates strength and vulnerability. Yes, and but. Vulnerability shared is not weakness, and it is courage." Maya put her arm around Silvara and said, "You are a quick learner. I had good teachers," and Silvara replied. A Sylvani child approached nervously, and she looked at the two of them and asked, "May I try?" "Try what?" And Maya asked gently. "A hug," and the child said, "And I felt it through the bond, and it seemed warm." Silvara held out her arms, and the child rushed into them and wrapped her small arms around the warrior, and Silvara held her close while her eyes filled with tears. And when the child pulled back, she was smiling. That was nice. And the child said, "And can we do it again sometime?" "Any time you need," and Silvara promised. Ember made a sound that might have been laughter, and several human children who had been watching approached cautiously and asked if they could touch the dragon. Ember lowered his head and let them pet his scales, and the children giggled with delight, and a few Sylvani young ones joined them, and soon the great dragon was surrounded by laughing children from two worlds. Claire sat down on Silvara's other side and said, "You did something incredible today, and you brought two dying peoples back to life." Silvara looked at her friends and her dragon and the mingling crowds, and she said no. And we did this together, and that is the entire point. 6 months had passed since the battle that changed everything, and Thesara Prime had transformed from a crash site into a thriving colony where humans and Sylvani lived and worked together in ways that both species were still learning to navigate. Maya walked through the settlement, watching children from two worlds play together, and human kids were teaching Sylvani young ones how to play tag, while the Sylvani children showed humans how to communicate with the small forest dragons that nested in the ancient trees. The colony had grown beyond the original survivors as more humans arrived from other settlements, and more Sylvani came from their hidden worlds, drawn by reports of what Silvara had discovered about the power of connection. Buildings rose that blended human engineering with Sylvani organic architecture, and the result was beautiful in unexpected ways, with structures that seemed to grow from the earth while incorporating technology that both species contributed. Claire ran a cultural exchange center where she taught Sylvani about human customs and emotions and learned from them about their psychic abilities and meditation techniques, and her classes were always full with both species eager to understand each other. Kate commanded a joint military force where human pilots flew alongside dragon riders, and they had already repelled 3 more Krath incursions using tactics that neither species could have developed alone. But the greatest change was in how people touched Sylvani, who had once recoiled from physical contact, now initiated hugs and held hands and sat close to friends, and humans had learned Sylvani techniques for mental connection that deepened their bonds beyond just the physical. Maya found Silvara in the training yard, where she was teaching a mixed group of recruits, and the warrior moved between human and Sylvani students with equal comfort, and she corrected stances with gentle touches and praised good form with shoulder pats. When the class ended, Silvara walked over to Maya and immediately pulled her into a hug, and the gesture that had once shocked the warrior was now as natural as breathing. "You are smiling." And Maya observed, "And I remember when you first arrived and you looked so alone even with Ember beside you." "I was alone." And Silvara said, "And my people were dying in our isolation, and we told ourselves it was strength, and we were really just afraid." "Afraid of what?" And Maya asked. "Of exactly this." And Silvara gestured to the bustling colony and of needing someone, and of letting them see us vulnerable, and of the pain that comes when you lose someone you have bonded with, and we thought avoiding connection meant avoiding pain, and we were only creating a different kind of suffering. They walked together toward the central plaza, where a ceremony was being prepared, and today marked the official founding of the joint colony, and representatives from both human and Sylvani governments were arriving. Commander Varys approached with a young Sylvani beside her, and the commander had changed remarkably in 6 months, and she smiled now and touched people easily, and she had become one of the strongest advocates for continued cooperation. "This is my daughter Kayla," and Varys said, "and she has asked to study human child development with Dr. Bennett." The young Sylvani looked nervous, and she said, "I want to understand how human children learn to bond so easily. And among my people, young ones are raised in isolation until they prove themselves, and I think we have been doing it wrong." Claire appeared and said, "I would be honored to teach you, and maybe you can teach me about Sylvani child rearing in return." Kayla brightened and impulsively hugged Claire and then looked embarrassed, but Claire just laughed and hugged her back. That would have been unthinkable 6 months ago, and Varys said quietly to Maya and my daughter, initiating physical contact with a stranger, and a human no less. But now it feels natural. Change comes faster when people are ready for it. And Maya replied. The ceremony began with speeches from various leaders, but the real moment came when a Sylvani elder stood to speak. And she was ancient even by their long-lived standards, and she had opposed the alliance from the beginning. I have lived for over 800 years. And the elder said, and I have seen my people slowly fade, and we became so focused on individual strength that we forgot we were a community, and I resisted this change because I was afraid. She paused and looked around at the mixed crowd and continued, but I have watched children laugh together, regardless of species, and I have seen warriors protect each other with their lives, and I have felt through the psychic bond what connection truly means. And I was wrong. The elder stepped down from the platform and walked directly to Maya and held out her hand in the human gesture of greeting. "Will you teach an old fool how to shake hands properly?" And she asked with a slight smile. Maya took her hand gently and said, "There is no wrong way to reach for connection." The elder smiled and then surprised everyone by pulling Maya into an awkward but sincere hug, and when they separated, she had tears in her ancient eyes. "Now I understand why my people were dying," and she said, "and we had forgotten how to hold each other." The celebration that followed mixed human and Sylvani traditions, and there was music from both cultures and food shared freely, and dancing that blended styles in ways that created something entirely new. Paul Grant, the colonist who had betrayed them, approached Maya hesitantly, and his family followed behind him. And over the past 6 months he had worked tirelessly to earn back trust, and many people had forgiven him, though some still kept their distance. "Thank you for giving me a second chance," and Paul said, "and I know I do not deserve it. You earned it." And Maya replied, "And you proved that people can change when given support." A Sylvani warrior named Theron joined them and said, "Paul has been teaching me about human concepts of redemption, and among my people a betrayal like his would mean permanent exile or death, and your way is harder, but perhaps wiser. It is not always wisdom." And Paul said honestly, "And sometimes it is just hope that people can be better than their worst moments." Theron clasped Paul's shoulder in a gesture he had learned from humans, and said, "You have certainly proven that—" As evening fell, Silvara found Maya sitting on a hill overlooking the colony with Ember resting beside them, and the dragon had grown comfortable with Maya over the months, and he allowed her to lean against his warm scales. Claire joined them carrying drinks, and Kate appeared moments later, and the four of them sat together watching lights come on across the settlement. "Do you think it will last?" And Kate asked, "And this peace between our peoples?" "Nothing lasts forever," and Silvara said, but we have built something worth fighting to protect. And more importantly, we have learned that strength comes from standing together." Claire raised her glass and said to connections that change worlds. They touched their glasses, together in a human toast, and Ember rumbled his agreement. A group of children ran past chasing fireflies, and Maya recognized her own niece among them, running alongside Kaila and other mixed groups, and their laughter echoed through the warm night. "That is what we are protecting," and Maya said, "and not just peace or survival, but the chance for the next generation to grow up, knowing that connection is strength." Silvara leaned her head on Maya's shoulder and said, "I think about that first day when you offered me your hand, and I was so afraid of such a simple gesture. And if someone had told me then that 6 months later I would be surrounded by friends and teaching others to hug and living in a community that spans 2 species, and I would have thought they were mad." "What changed your mind?" and Claire asked. "Everything," and Silvera replied, but mostly it was feeling what I had been missing, and you cannot unknow warmth once you have felt it, and you cannot go back to isolation once you have experienced true connection." Kate said, "The Krath are regrouping, and intelligence suggests they will attack again within the year." Let them come, and Silvara said with quiet confidence, and they expect to face isolated defenders, and instead they will face unified forces and humans and Silvani fighting side by side, and dragons and technology working as one, and they cannot win against that. More than that, and Maya added, and they cannot win against people who have something worth protecting and who have learned that, together, they are stronger than the sum of their parts. Ember lifted his head and roared softly and across the colony. Other dragons answered, and the sound was like a song of unity that echoed through the night. Silvara stood and pulled Maya to her feet and said, "Come, and there is someone I want you to meet." They walked to a small garden where an elderly Silvani woman sat with a human child in her lap, and she was reading to the girl from a book that mixed human and Silvani languages. "This is Elder Miriana," and Silvara said, "and she is the keeper of our oldest histories, and she has been writing a new chapter about what happened here." The elder looked up with kind eyes and said, "I am recording everything, and so future generations will know how two dying peoples saved each other and how a simple handshake became the foundation for a new civilization." The human child in her lap yawned and snuggled closer, and Miriana stroked her hair with a gentleness that would have been unthinkable for a Silvani elder just months ago. "This is what survival looks like," and Miriana said, "and not walls and weapons and isolation, and but communities that care for each other, and children who sleep peacefully in the arms of those who protect them." Maya and Silvara left the elder to her reading, and walked back toward the main colony, and everywhere they looked there were signs of the bond that had formed between their peoples, a Silvani teaching humans to meditate, and humans teaching Silvani to laugh freely, and warriors from both species training together, and scientists collaborating on projects and families forming that crossed species lines through adoption and mentorship. "We did something impossible," and Maya said, "No." And Silvara corrected gently, "And we did something that should have been obvious, and we reached for each other when we were afraid, and we chose connection over isolation. And we proved that touching someone's soul really does start with touching their hand." They found Claire and Kate again, and the four friends stood together looking at the colony they had helped build. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the Krath would return, and there would be conflicts and misunderstandings and setbacks along the way. But tonight there was peace, and there was connection, and there were two species learning together that strength came not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand together. Ember settled beside them and allowed all four to lean against his warm scales. And the dragon who had once bonded only with Silvara now shared his warmth freely with all of them. And in that moment, with friends beside her, and a community thriving below, and stars shining above, and Silvara felt something she had not felt in her long life. She felt home.